I would like to wrap up this module on the flipped classroom with a little story about a time that I unflipped my classroom. A couple of years ago, I was assigned to teach a linear algebra course. And for the first time teaching this course, the textbook for the course was selected by the department. There were multiple sections running, and they wanted to have a consistent textbook across all those sections, and so that made sense. Unfortunately, it wasn't a textbook that I was very fond of. I've taught this linear algebra course kind of mostly for engineering students several times, and I found that I need to be really particular about the order of content in this course and kind of the treatment of certain topics, and I just wasn't crazy about the textbook. It didn't work for how I wanted to teach the course. And so while we had a textbook, I didn't want to rely on that textbook to flip my classroom, as I had been doing for years at that point. I didn't want students to read that textbook before class because it would kind of confuse them, I think, given how I wanted to treat the material. And I didn't take the time, I didn't really have the time that summer to come up with a bunch of lecture videos or other resources that I could use. And so I unflipped my classroom. For the first time in years, I had my students come to class with no pre-class activity whatsoever, so that the first exposure to the material came during class. And I want to share 3 observations of this experience that I think shed some light on some of the value that the flipped classroom provides. One is the kind of coming to class phenomenon. So in the flipped model, again, one that I had used for years, students would come to class having seen the material. They'd be a little bit confused, some of them might be interested, and they would leave class generally feeling a lot better about the material because we were going through that practice and feedback phase, and they'd feel like they had maybe learned something. In the unflipped classroom, students came to class not knowing what to expect, and they left class a little bit confused, right? It was their first exposure to the material. They hadn't mastered it. And so the affect in the classroom was actually a lot different, a lot more kind of frustration, confusion, and I wasn't crazy about that. The other observation is that given that most of the practice and feedback in this class happened after class through the problem sets that I assigned, office hours became really critical for students to really get the feedback that they needed from me about the material. Now, that's not all bad. I work pretty hard to get my students to come to office hours because I find it really helpful to work with them one-on-one or in small groups and get a real sense of what they're struggling with. But it really meant that office hours had to be a critical part of this course. I had to schedule them at times that I thought students would really make it. And there were some students who wouldn't or couldn't make office hours, and I think they suffered because of that. The practice and feedback section, which is so critical to learning, was something that they did largely on their own. The third observation is that it seemed to me that students in this class, this unflipped classroom, spent more time cramming for tests. In the flipped model, I think students are kind of asked to keep up with the material on a more regular basis. They have to prepare for class every class session. And so the learning that they do is distributed over time. Whereas in the unflipped model, a lot of my students didn't have to do that. They could, in a sense, wait till the night before the test and then spend hours and hours studying for that test. Again, given what I observed of the emails, the questions I got when students came to office hours, there seemed to be a lot more cramming in this offering of the course. There's pretty good research evidence that shows that cramming does not lead to long-term learning. So in my unflipped classroom, test scores were fine, but I worried that students actually didn't retain as much after the class was over because of the cramming. And so for these 3 reasons, I'm more convinced than ever that the flipped classroom approach is a better approach, both for the kind of student-instructor experience and the relationships that we have, but also for student learning, particularly long-term learning. And so I'll end with this question that I raised earlier, the one that I think is at the heart of the flipped classroom idea. How can we make the most of the relatively limited time we have with students during class? Again, maybe 150 minutes a week. As you're thinking about courses that involve cooperative learning, problem-based learning, peer instruction, any kind of active learning that you're going to build into the classroom, I hope you'll think of the flipped classroom as a framework of sorts for making that kind of active learning quite possible in the classroom by shifting around what students do before and after class. Thanks for your participation in this module, and I hope you found it helpful.